Okay, so here's the spreadsheet, and we can see what the problem is. We've got a grid that's been filled in, marks for each category for each project, but there's about 30 different students, and we want to get the average mark for each of the categories on each of the projects. So we need to add all of these together and divide by the number in the set. To do this, we can state the overall problem like that, but we need to try and break it down into steps. Like this is coming up with an algorithm to solve the problem. Very simple, but just have to try and think a bit like a machine. So the machine's going to be able to do one addition at a time. Given that it can only do one addition at a time, and we need to specify which numbers it's adding, then we need to think of the simplest way that could be done. Really, the simplest way is to take all the marks in the grid and put them into one long line, and then we can take that one long line of marks and add it to another long line of marks in another grid, and then add the next grid to the sum of the first two, and then the next grid to the sum of the first three, and then we can keep adding them together, each time adding one long line of marks. So to do that then, the steps really that we'll be going through, as it says on the PowerPoint presentation, read each grid of data into some sort of linear container, which actually you call a variable. Read the next grid and add that to the first, one number at a time, remember, that's what the computer can do, add one thing at a time. We need to keep a record of the number of grids because we need to divide by that number to get the average. So we then just keep reading and adding grids until there's no more grids. And then in a new sheet, we need to print the new long line of numbers, but we need to print it as a grid. So to begin with, reading each grid of data into a linear container, we're reading a two-dimensional grid into a long line. Then we keep doing that for each of the sheets and adding one to the next. And then at the end, we're turning the long line of data back into a grid. Okay, so to write your code for doing this, first of all, you need to find a space to write it. To do that, you need to open the Developer tab in Excel. See, actually in mine it's already there because I've used it, but in yours it might not be. So to do that, first of all, you need to go to Options. Go to Options. And then Customize the ribbon. This is set right straight away to popular commands, so the sorts of things that people do change on the grid. And then select the main tab, and obviously in mine it's already ticked. So here the pull down, they are main tabs, okay, and in yours the developer one probably won't be ticked. You should tick that. You should also tick the add-ins if you haven't done so as well, because that's where your statistical packages are. If they're unticked, these two, then tick both of these, and then that's okay. Then you'll have this new tab which you've maybe not seen before, and the easiest way to, so perhaps the best way for you to do this at this point is to press record macro. You can give it the name actually, let's call it Sheets Average. Okay. Now it can be stored in the workbook in which you're working, or actually in your personal macro workbook. For the moment, let's store it in the workbook where you're working. You can put a description at some point. And then if you just do anything now, it will be recorded in the in Visual Basic. It's a very useful thing when you're actually writing programs to help you and to get started in writing the program. In this case, there's not much use to it, but just if you type 1, 2, 3 in there, and then you've got the option to stop recording. Stop recording now, and then Visual Basic, or you can see the shortcut is Alt F11. It will show you the code that you've actually recorded. So you've recorded this rather than written it. We don't actually need it at this point, so you can delete that. But you can see we started up with the name of your macro, and where there's an apostrophe, these are the comments which explain what's going on in the code. These aren't part of the code, this is what you write in order to explain what the code's doing. It's very important to write this in, because when you write the code you know what it's there for and what it's doing, but when you're not using it, it's very easy to forget that, and it will also help other people understand your code. It's one of the things that you can't put enough of. It's always one of the complaints that people don't have enough comments to explain what's going on in their code. But to put comments, you just start with an apostrophe, and then the type will actually be written in green after that, so it's easy to recognize as being the comments. So far we've got no code apart from the opening line, which is sub sheets average and then open and close brackets, and that's how all the code starts in Visual Basic for applications. And the end, which is end sub. At the moment it won't do anything. Now we need to consider again what it is that we were trying to do. So we wanted to read each grid of data into a linear container. A linear container is a variable, so we want to read the two-dimensional grid into a linear variable. So if we take that as the first thing we need to do, well, I've copied in the first part of the code to show you and just to tell you what's going on in it. We said that what we needed to do is to read each grid of data into a linear container. The linear container is what we call a variable, and the first thing we need to do, because the machine has no idea what the variable is, we have to declare the variables, and this first part of the code is declaring the variables. You can see first of all I've put in some more comments to explain what the code is. The next thing, there's a comment to say that we're declaring the variables, and these are statements to declare the variables. Dim is short for dimension, but that is a word, that's a code word, that's part of the vocabulary. myworksheets is the name I've given to the variable, so that's a space in the memory that I've named. By saying dim myworksheets, it's making it explicit that I've given that name to the variable. There's some names that you can't use for variables because they're parts of the vocabulary, so I couldn't call a variable dim because that's actually a vocabulary word. I've also declared the variable. I've also said what kind of variable it is. I've said it's an integer, so the numbers that will be present in it will be integers, so whole numbers. And I've declared a whole set of other variables which we'll be using in the program. We don't need to worry about those at the moment. We'll come back to those, but that's the first step though. We need to declare the variables, and we use a dim statement for doing that. Then these are all variables that have just got space for one number in them. Remember, the thing that we've said we need to do is to read a grid of data into a linear container. So that container is a variable that's going to have more than one number in it. So we're also going to dimension an array, as it says in the comment. So it's another variable, but it's a type of variable that takes more than one number. So you can see the dim statement saying that we're dimensioning the array, declaring it. The name of the variable, that's what we're going to call it, linmarks. It's useful to call it something that relates to what's in there. So linmarks is linear marks, and the size of it in this case, it's 1 to 136. That's the set of numbers that that fill that grid that we're interested in. If you remember, there's 8 projects, and there's 17 rows of marks. So 8 by 17 is 136. So we've declared a variable that will hold 136 numbers. Then it's good practice to actually fill that array with 0 values. So we'll do that here, and this is using very important. So to fill that array of 136 numbers with zeros, we're going to use, for the first time at this point, the power of the computer, because we don't want to do something 136 times. And so the statements that are used here are typical for what goes on in a computer program, and largely what computer programs are about. So they'll repeat things for you. And in this case, the way that repetition is done is by using a for next statement. So there's a for and a next. And between the for and the next, there's something that we want to do. And you can see what we're doing is setting the value in that linmarks variable to 0. But we need to do it 136 times. And each of the spaces in that variable we need to be set to 0. So in order to do that, we need to have another variable, which is int I. Again, that's just a name. You can see we've declared it here as an integer. So for int I equals 1 to 136, so that means it's going to go through this loop of going for next, for next, for next, 136 times until we get to 136, and then it will stop. So each time it goes through, it will set the value to 0. So linmarks, first of all, it's going to be 1. Linmarks 1, the first space is going to equal 0. Then it will go around again and again. And essentially, that's largely what you get done with a computer program. So that's using a loop. So typically a for next loop. Now, other things that will come up are statements that are conditionals, where there'll be a different route that's taken through the program according to a conditional statement, where we'll be using if statements. We haven't got any of those in this program because it's very simple. So we've dimensioned our arrays. We've made these linear containers. Now we need to read each grid of data into the linear container. You can guess how that's going to be done because you've already seen a for next loop. So you know you're going to be using for next loops to read the data in. Now we're not reading data in from one linear container into another linear container. If we were, then we'd just write a for next loop to move through the one container and move the data to the other. But actually we're reading it from a grid into a linear container. And that means that we're going to use what we call a nested for next loop. So again, just going back to the PowerPoint, you can see the code actually break it down to these steps. First thing we've done is make the declarations. So we've defined and initialized the variables. Now we need to loop through the sheets, the columns and the rows. Now you've seen a loop, it's a for next loop, but instead of it just being a for next loop that's moving through one linear variable, it's got to actually loop through the set of sheets, which is our big problem. We've got 50 of, or 30, 40, 50 of those. So it's got to loop through all the sheets, and then the data in those sheets is arranged not just in a column, but in columns and rows. So it's got to loop through the sheets, the columns and the rows. Once we've done that, as it's looped through and added them all together, we'll make a new sheet, and then we'll loop through the sheet, entering the new data. So I've put in the code then that loops through the data. It's starting here. So this is the bit we're looking at. So again, it's commented. It says loop through all the worksheets. So this is the first part. We've got to make sure that we go through every one of the worksheets. And when we've been through in each worksheet, we then have to go along each column of data and each row of data in the column. So you can see from this structure that there's a for next loop to go through each worksheet. So here's the for, which is to do with worksheets, and here's the next for the worksheets. And then within that we've got for and a next to go through the columns. So there's the for the columns and the next for the columns. Then we've got a for the rows and a next for the rows. So each of these for next loops has got a variable associated with it, which has been declared at the top. This is where that first variable, the myworksheets variable, is used. So for each myworksheet, and then it's been declared in worksheets. Now this is a special vocabulary word for Excel. In the previous for next loop, where we're filling in the array up here, we've gone for int I, which is our variable, equals 1 to 136. So they're numbers. You recognize those. But this is actually for each myworksheet in worksheets. So these are special vocabulary words. So you don't have to know how many worksheets there are, and you don't have to know what the names of them are either, because we can use these special words for each in, are methods for these particular objects. So in worksheets, you can tell that they're vocabulary words because they start with a capital letter. The words that we use ourselves, like these variables that we've made up, they don't start with a capital letter. But if you use a vocabulary word, then it will start with a capital letter. The capital letters will be written in automatically. So if you've used a vocabulary word, once you've actually entered the word, it'll become capitalized. So if you try and name a variable, you think you're using a name that's a name that you've come up with as a variable. When you enter that word, if it comes up with a capital letter, then you know it's a word that you can't use as a variable. Anyway, what we have here is a set of nested for next loops. You can see we've got 3 of them. The first one to work through the number of worksheets. So imagine as the code reads, we get to this point where it says for each worksheet, each myworksheet in worksheets. We've got another variable here which is number of sheets. Again, it's a variable we've named. Numsheets equals numsheets plus 1. So numsheets equals 0 is outside of the loop. So we've initialized number of sheets as equaling 0. Once we've moved into this first for next loop, number of sheets changes to being equal to number of sheets, which was its initial value of 0, plus 1. So every time it goes through that loop, number of sheets gets added 1 to. So it acts as a counter. By the end of it, we've worked out the number of sheets, because the value that's stored in the variable numsheets will be the number of sheets. So for each worksheet, each myworksheet in worksheets, so we've got to the point then where we're directing the program to the first worksheet. In that worksheet, if we go down to here, we've got another for next loop, and that's for sscol equals 3. So sscol is a variable again that we've just named, but it equals 3 to 10. And then within that we've got another for next loop which is for the rows. For the rows equals 5 to 21. And by the time we get to the rows in the first column of the first worksheet, then we actually do a little bit of arithmetic, which is to take the value in our linear variable, which at this point, if you remember, is equal to 0 because we've set everything to 0. So linmarks x, which is the first position in there, equals linmarks x plus the value that's in the cell that's referred to by these two variables, ssrow and sscol. And in this case, the first one will be 3, column 3, row 5. Column 3, row 5, and the dot there lets you know that the next thing after that is the property that you want to read in that cell. That cell has all sorts of properties. It's got a color, it's got a font, it's got all these things. The thing we're usually most bothered about is the value, and that's what we want to read. So the value in that cell, so cell 3, 5, we're going to add that to the value that's already in our linear array, and at this point that value in the linear array is 0. So I'll add it in there. Then we increase x to x plus 1. X is the position, you can see we set it here, x is the position in the linear array, and so we're increasing that to the position x plus 1, so that's 1 plus 1, so it's position 2. Then it says next ssrow, so then we go on to the next row. So this loop is going to go round the internal loop here first of all. It's going to work through rows 5 to 21. So in the first column of data it's going to work through from 5 to 21, adding the numbers in rows 5 to 21 to the numbers that are already present in the variable. To start with, the values in the variable are 0. After it's looped through all the rows in the first column on the first spreadsheet, so we get to row 21. So once we've got to for row 21, it goes to next. It goes to the next column, and the next column going from columns 3 to 10, so it'll go to column 4, and in column 4 it'll read through all the rows again, and then it'll go to column 5. So it's going to circulate all through the marks in the grids, adding them together. It's going to circulate through all the marks in the grid, adding them into our linear variable linmarks. So that'll be 136 numbers that are read in. Then it's going to go to next myworksheet. So we go to next myworksheet, it's back up to here. So next myworksheet here increases the number of sheets, but then it also returns the marker in linmarks, our linear variable, returns that marker to x equals 1. So when it goes through the whole process again, you can see that we're adding the values in the cells of the next worksheet to the values that are already present in our linmarks variable. Okay, that's here. So linmarks equals linmarks x, so the value that's already there, plus the value in the next cell. So that's how we go around adding them all together. At the same time, we're recording the number of sheets. So with that information, we've got the sum of the marks from every worksheet in each cell, and we've also got the number of sheets. From that we can print out the average, and that's the last thing we need to do. It's going to be reversing the process of reading the data into a linear variable. We want to read the linear variable back out into a grid, and so you can guess again that we're going to be using nested for next loops to do that. Just as it says there, the last thing, well, before that we need to make a new sheet, and that's going to be using special vocabulary words that are used in Visual Basic for applications, making a new sheet, and then we're going to loop through the sheet, entering the new data. Okay, so we've added in the last bit of the code. You can see the first comment of the new bit of the code, make a new sheet for the average values. And again, these are words that are special vocabulary words for Excel. And we've got sheets, which is the object. So that's a capital letter there, sheets is the object. And there's a method for it, and the method is add. So we can just put sheets add, and it'll put a new sheet in. You can specify which position you put the sheet in. We don't need to bother with that. If you wanted to specify, you can put another full stop, and you can look up the different fields that you can have for that, and there's a whole load of them where you could put the different sheet in different positions. We don't really care, and the default position is to put it as the first sheet, and that's fine for us. We'll just have it as the first sheet. So there we go, we've made a new sheet. Now we set the linmarks array to the first position. So we get our array, we're reading from the first position, and then we've got a nested for next loop to go across the spreadsheet. So from column to column across the spreadsheet, from column to column across the spreadsheet, and then down each row in the columns. And as the program goes through these nested for next loops, within them we're reading the value in the variable, so linmarks x, dividing it by the number of sheets, so that's the sum of the marks from the grids divided by the number of sheets, so that'll give us the average, and that value is being read into the cell in this position, cell ssrow, sscolumn, and we've got ssrow, the first one is, sscolumn, the first one is column 3, and the first row is column 5, so the first of these will be row 5, column 3. That value is going to be set equal to the average. In other words, the value from linmarks divided by the number of sheets. Then we increment x to x plus 1, which means we move to the next position in the linear variable linmarks, and then we go around to the next row. And we go through those rows until we get to 21, and then it'll come to the next column. So that data is going to be put from the linear variable linmarks into a grid. And then that'll end. Now, a good way to see what's going on with the program is that you can step through it. If you want to be clear what's going on, you can step through it. And to step through it, you can just press F8. So it doesn't really matter where you start, but if you put the cursor at the start and then press F8, it goes through line by line. And as you're going through this, right, this is initializing the array. You can put the cursor on any variable and it'll tell you in the variable. It'll tell you what the value of the variable is. So we've got it up to 6 there. If we keep pressing, it's got to go up to 136. So it's fairly dull doing this, but you can see what's going to go on. As you keep on working through, you can see the program working its way around. And then you can follow each of the loops. For instance, a bit further down you can see this is working through the main set of nested for next loops. And you can see we've got values in here, so we're up to position 11 in linmarks. We're up to row 14, column 3. Number of sheets is 1, so still on the first one. So you can keep on flashing through those and you'll see the way that it works through. So you can follow the program structure through just by doing that, and then you can press stop to reset it. Then if you actually want to run the program, the data's there. We can try running it. To run it, you can press F5 or you can just press on run. Okay, and then you can, if you press Alt F11, and there's your set of averages.